Is there something distinct about Protestant theology as compared to other streams of theology through church history? And more specifically, what about the role of Martin Luther in developing theological thought? Well, that's the topic of Philip Cary's 2019 book, The Meaning of Protestant Theology. Let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, I've reviewed some more popular books on this channel, and I guess that's a good way to get views and clicks and whatnot. But I do want to occasionally look at more obscure titles that I particularly found interesting or intriguing in the hopes that maybe some people watching this will look them up too. And I think that's the case for this book, which came out in 2019 by Philip Cary, The Meaning of Protestant Theology. It's not super well known, and I kind of wish it had more attention because there's a lot in here to think about. But the main idea, follow my typical format here, main idea, research, readability, reasonableness. The main idea here is that there's something specific about particularly what Martin Luther brought to Protestant theology, and more specifically than that, Philip Cary's argument is that he developed a specific kind of way of looking at Augustine from centuries before. So Augustine contributed something specific, and then Luther contributed something specific on top of him that sets him apart not only from broader Catholic theology and medieval theology, but also even from other reformers like Calvin. There's something very, very specific about Luther's thought. Namely, as the subtitle says, Luther believed that the gospel gives you something outside of yourself that forgives you, the person of Christ. And that's a very different thing than even what Calvin was thinking or Zwingli or some of the other reformers. So that's kind of the main idea here of the book, and he develops that historically. It kind of gives an intellectual history leading up to that. The research behind it is really excellent research, particularly as it relates to Plato, Augustine, and Luther's historical thought. So those three figures figure prominently in this book. And man, the synthesis of Plato's thought, Augustine's thought, and Luther's thought is pretty astounding from a research perspective. I mean, Philip Cary knows his philosophy and knows his intellectual history, especially of Luther. I mean, his readings of Luther are so close, so careful, very well footnoted, so you can chase down stuff that he's talking about. So really, probably in terms of my categories, is probably the highest, strongest aspect of the book is the research. The readability of it is a little bit of a mixed bag. I'm going to say some of both sides of that. On the good side, this book has one of my absolute favorite presentations of Platonic philosophy, Plato's thought. In the very beginning, opening chapters, he synthesizes kind of Platonic metaphysics. And I've read a lot of histories of philosophy and synthesis of Plato's thought because it shows up in so much theology. But this is probably one of my favorites. His description of Plato's metaphysics and the reading of the famous story of the cave and all that, it's superb in my opinion in this book. It's really, really good and very readable, very understandable. Similarly, his summary and synthesis of Augustine is very, very good. Also in the beginning, that's all kind of in part one of the book. It's also one of the better presentations of Augustine's thought that I've read. And I've also read a good bit of that. So that's all really excellent. I will say it does bog down, in my opinion, it bogs down a bit in part two, which is the Luther section. Part two it's like part biography of Luther, but more of a development of his thought, not necessarily a life story, but just kind of a tracing how his thought changed over the course of his writings and preaching. And it gets pretty, and he even says, he's like, I know I'm going to get slow and technical here, but it's such an important part of his argument that he breaks it down very carefully, but it does bog down in the reading. And then part three picks back up in terms of readability, but it stays fairly technical as he tries to apply it to ministry and to kind of the life of the church and stuff today. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but man, I can't emphasize enough that part one on Plato and Augustine, it is just outstanding. If you want a readable, very comprehensible presentation of Augustine and Plato, this is totally worth the money just even for that section. Okay, finally, the reasonableness. I'm going to land here. There's a lot, man. It's a fairly long book and a somewhat slow read overall, so there's a lot that could be pulled out of here. But as I already said, it's a fantastic presentation of Plato and Augustine, and I think it's a compelling and basically persuasive and convincing argument that Luther developed that thought in a specific way. More specifically, he kind of makes the case that that Augustine was right about metaphysics in the ways that he adopted some of Plato's metaphysics, but that Augustine took some missteps in epistemology in terms of how it applies to Christian life and faith. That he would say that Augustine took on too much of the beatific vision kind of intellectual approach, intellectual assent to the vision of God, which is very Platonic, and that he would argue that Augustine made a misstep in kind of adopting that into not only epistemology but even ethics too, and how the Christian should live. And he argues that Luther corrected that. So Luther took what was right about Augustine's use of Plato's metaphysics. This is the intellectual history of the case that he makes. But that then Luther took that key Protestant distinction of epistemology and ethics and recognizing that it's not up to us to intellectually ascend to God, but that actually Christ comes to us. And it's something outside of us that then pronounces forgiveness and acceptance and grace upon us, and we can rest in the truth of that external to us pronouncement upon ourselves, which is kind of missing in Augustine, as you would say. That's a very long technical argument boiled down into basically a paragraph. And I found, as someone I'm not particularly Lutheran or haven't been historically, but I've been studying him more lately, as a Protestant myself, but as someone who hasn't really dove deep into Luther, I found that very compelling, and it cohered with what I know of Luther already and other Lutheran kind of theologians I've read. That makes sense as a way to understand his development of his thought. And more broadly, more historically, it's very compelling to see that as a distinct contribution of Luther, even within the Reformation kind of milieu. So he's even apart from people like Calvin, who are obviously really well known in Reformation thought. I found that compelling and overall convincing, but it's something I want to learn a little bit more about from maybe people of a more Calvinistic bent than a Lutheran bent. But man, overall, as a nuancing of Luther within the world of the Reformation and as a compelling case of something specific that Luther brought, it's a really, really excellent book and a very good read. And I'll also say that he unpacks things like what does a sacramental theology look like for Protestants who would do well, I would argue and agree with him, do well to learn more from Luther about the sacraments. That's one way he's different from others like Calvin and Zwingli. But also just the general approach, the lived life of faith towards salvation, adopting a more Lutheran approach to that, I think is pretty liberatory, especially for a lot of evangelical kind of anxieties. So anyways, that's a lot that can be boiled down in a book, but I wanted to highlight this because I found it very thought-provoking. If you are someone who's Catholic or Protestant, person of faith, or even, I would honestly say, even if you're not a Christian, but you're just interested in kind of theological reflection as the intellectual history through some of these major figures that are giants in the West, whether you like it or not. Augustine is a major Western thinker figure. Man, this is a really excellent book, and it's one that I would really easily recommend if you can work through some technical writing, particularly as it relates to Lutheran thought. So that is The Meaning of Protestant Theology, Luther, Augustine, and the Gospel That Gives Us Christ. Very excellent, something I'm going to be referring to in time to come, especially as a preacher and as a minister myself. So thanks for watching. Hope you found this thoughtful and interesting.